Well, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Scriptorium webcast on an introduction to the DITA Open Toolkit, or as I like to call it, a gentle introduction to the Open Toolkit. My name is Simon Bate. I'll be the presenter today. I'm a senior technical consultant at Scriptorium. I like to say I've been in publications about 30 years, 10 years as a writer, 10 years as a manager or manager-writer, and then the past 10 plus years I've been doing what I really love to do, and that's to develop tools. Now, of course, I've been doing tools development my whole professional career. My motto is let the computer do the work. And of course, you can't develop tools without starting to teach people how to use the tools you develop. So with that, I moved on into training, and I'm a certified technical trainer. I do a number of our classes here at Scriptorium. I've had about 4 years of experience now working in DITA and the DITA Open Toolkit, modifying it. A little bit about Scriptorium. At Scriptorium, we focus on a content strategy for technical communication. So people will come to us with problems in their technical publications departments. Their management has said you've got to go to XML, or you need to localize to 20 languages, or they've got an old tool set they need to move forward to something newer. We'll analyze a problem. We will propose a solution. We can implement that solution. We can transform documents to the new data types if that's necessary, and we can also provide training. So now, on to our topic at hand. Just an overview of what we're going to cover today. There's a lot to cover, so excuse me if I talk a little too fast. I'll try and slow down. First off, we'll look at what is the DITA Open Toolkit. We'll talk about the features provided, the features of the DITA Open Toolkit. We'll talk about how to download and install the Open Toolkit. Then we'll take rather a lengthy tour of the contents of the DITA Open Toolkit folder. It's very useful to see what's there, and that's really the purpose of this discussion, is to allow you to see what's in the DITA Open Toolkit and what it means to you if you're going to be modifying the Open Toolkit, using it, or even specializing. We'll then examine how to run the DITA Open Toolkit. We'll look a little bit at how it works, and then we'll wrap up with a discussion of DITA plugins, DITA Open Toolkit plugins, and the plugin architecture. So what is the DITA Open Toolkit? Well, of course, DITA is the Darwin Information Typing Architecture. It's an XML architecture that allows topic-based authoring and publishing. The DITA specification itself is developed, maintained by an OASIS working group. There's a formal process that goes into determining what is in each release of DITA, determining the architecture, and there's a specification released. Now, the specification says how things should work in DITA, so it says how a cross-reference, or how a conref, or how a key reference should work in DITA, but it doesn't actually say anything about how to implement them. So DITA on itself, on its own, is just the architectural standard. So in addition to that, then, we have the DITA Open Toolkit. And the DITA Open Toolkit is the portion that actually implements the output, generating output from your DITA files. Now, the DITA standard, as I said, was maintained by the OASIS working group, and there's a long, slow, careful process in determining what's in the DITA specification itself. The DITA Open Toolkit, on the other hand, is actually open source. And everything about the Open Toolkit you can find on SourceForge. So any of you, if you want to, if you see fit, you can actually go to the DITA Open Toolkit section on SourceForge and make modifications. You can change it, and you can help contribute to the process. So, of course, the DITA Open Toolkit then creates our deliverables. Now, there are alternatives to the DITA Open Toolkit. It's not the only way to create deliverables from DITA, and I think it's important just to point out a couple of them at this point. First off, there's FrameMaker. In FrameMaker, you can read DITA files in, and you can produce absolutely beautiful PDFs from it. And that's really, really FrameMaker's strength. Madcap Flare will read DITA files, and you can produce help files from Madcap if you need to from Flare. There's another tool, another free tool it's worth mentioning, and that is a tool called DITA To Go from Omnisys. And DITA To Go also produces very good PDFs. It produces fairly clean help. You can go to a number of different formats by that, and that's really worth an investigation. So DITA To Go and the number 2. Some features of the DITA Open Toolkit. Well, of course, the DITA Open Toolkit is for output. So we can produce a number of output formats in the Open Toolkit. A lot of HTML or HTML-based formats. So we can produce XHTML. We can produce Microsoft HTML help, Java help, Eclipse help. Those are all HTML-based formats, and they can all be generated from the DITA Open Toolkit. Also from the DITA Open Toolkit, we can produce PDF files. Now, the PDF actually, just as a side note, the PDF uses an intermediate language, and you may see this, and we'll talk a little bit about it as we go through the files. When you generate a PDF, what you do actually is you create a XSLFO file, that is formatting option, and which is an intermediate language. And then the FO file is processed by an FO processor, and that generates the PDF from your FO. There are 3 main FO processors currently on the market. There's FOP, which is free. It's from Apache, and of course you get what you pay for. It's fairly good, but not complete. There are 2 other commercial products. There's Antenna House and RenderX. Both have FO processors. They cost some money, but it is really worth it. If you want to generate clean PDFs from the DITA Open Toolkit, then you should investigate using one of those FO formatters. Another output format, we can generate Open Document or ODT files, and so this file, an ODT file, can be read by Microsoft Word, can also be read by OpenOffice.org or LibreOffice.org or wherever they're going with that open format. But ODT is a useful output. And there are other formats we can generate. And we can also easily add other formats to our output. The Open Toolkit supports specialization. Of course, specialization is a cornerstone of DITA. In DITA, the reason DITA is the Darwin information typing architecture is that Darwin wrote about specialization. And of course, he was writing about specialization of creatures in order to fill environmental niches. In our case, when we talk about specialization, we're talking about specialization of document types to meet. So we can specialize our topics in DITA, and when we specialize, what we're doing is we can add semantics to our document, so that makes it easier for our writers to know what's the content they're actually encoding, what they're wrapping with an element. But also the specialization allows us to produce customized output. And so if we wanted to create, say, a new note format, we could then in our output craft a special output format for that note, because we would know from the encoding that it is our specialized note. The Open Toolkit also supports customization. Now, customization is similar to specialization. The only real difference is that in specialization you modify the DTD, you modify the content model that is used that describes your XML structure. In customization, all you're doing is modifying output types or creating new output types. The DITA Open Toolkit also supports localization. It has 50 localizations built in. And you can extend these localizations, you can add new localizations you need, or you can even add the terms add new words if you need to those sets of localized terms. So let's talk about downloading and installing the Open Toolkit. As I said, the Open Toolkit is maintained on SourceForge, and you can go to this URL if you need, http://sourceforge.net project DITA. And if we go there, and I'm going to go there right now so I can show you what this looks like. If I get my shortcut here. So here we have our browser opening up, and when you go to that site, what you will see right off the bat is in the middle of the page is a green button, download DITA Open Toolkit 1.5.3, and this says, the rest of it says full easy install bin.zip. And almost all the time, when you need the DITA Open Toolkit, this is what you need. The reason it's the full easy install is this Open Toolkit version contains everything that you need for running the Open Toolkit. The only additional thing you need on your machine to run the DITA Open Toolkit is Java. But the full easy install includes Ant, which is used for driving the process of building your output. Processor. It contains the Apache FOP processor, so if you want to produce quick, easy PDFs, you can do it from there. So we won't go through the entire process of clicking on the button and doing the download, but just believe me, it doesn't take long. When you do the download, of course, you get the zip file in your folders. Now, when you open the zip file, of course, you're going to want to put this DITA OT 153 folder somewhere. And the place we recommend you put it is, let me pull another window on, in the root of your C drive. Now, the way I structure things on my machine, I always keep a DITA OT folder. Typically what I do is I keep a DITA OT folder, and then within there I keep various versions of the Open Toolkit that I'm working with. Today we have one, I've got one that I've just made sure that everything's working and right in it, and so I'm calling it DITA OT 153 webcast. You notice the one I do not have any spaces, and so the two things you want to avoid in your path name to your DITA Open Toolkit, you don't want to have spaces and you don't want to have special characters. So all you have to do is unzip that zip file, create the file, and there essentially you've done it. As long as you've got Java on your machine, you can run the DITA Open Toolkit. It's installed and ready to use. Now, before we go much further here, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the versions, the DITA versions and the DITA Open Toolkit versions. This is important, and bear with me, I'm going to throw a whole lot of numbers at you real fast, but the two numbers that you really want to keep focus on are 143 and 153. So when the DITA specification version 1.0 came out, of course, there soon had to be an Open Toolkit for processing, creating output, and that was, of course, DITA 1.0.x. There were a number of subversions. And through time, the Open Toolkit was refined. It was DITA 1.1, DITA OT 1.2. And then at some point, the DITA working group decided that it was time to start creating a DITA 1.1 standard. And when it reached a point of stability, the DITA Open Toolkit organization decided it's about time for an Open Toolkit that matches this, or that can handle all the new things in DITA 1.1. So they created DITA 1.3, sorry, DITA Open Toolkit 1.3. So the DITA Open Toolkit 1.3 supported the preliminary 1.1. There was also a DITA Open Toolkit 1.3.1. Then finally, the DITA working group finalized the 1.1 standard. It was approved, and so the Open Toolkit released DITA 1.4.0. There were a few subversions, and finally there was 1.4.3, and that was and is a fairly stable version. Now, of course, things don't stay the same. The working group decided to start work on DITA 1.2. And so, of course, once it reached a certain point of stability, Open Toolkit released then the DITA Open Toolkit 1.5.0 and then 1.5.1. Now, tool vendors took two approaches here. Some tool vendors said, oh, okay, let's roll forward and let's get everything, let's support whatever's there so that people can use the new stuff. Others said, no, we want our customers to remain on stable versions, and so some tool vendors decided to stay on DITA 1.1 and the DITA Open Toolkit 1.4.3. Now, the reason I bring this up is as I go through the directory, there are some differences between 1.4.3 and the current modern version 1.5.3, and I will point those out because depending on your tool vendors, depending on where you are, you may be actually using DITA OT 1.4.3, so you may need to see some differences. And of course, in December of last year, the 1.2 specification was finally approved. OT released 1.5.2, and then just this May, they have released 1.5.3, and that is the recent, most up-to-date stable version. So again, the two dates to remember mostly 1.4.3 and 1.5.3. So now let's take a tour of the contents of the Open Toolkit. I'm going to pull this window down here and grow it a bit. So first off, we'll tour the folders in just a minute. Let me point out the Open Toolkit contains a large number of files named build something. These are all ANT project files, and these are used for building various output types. The main one to focus on is build.xml because that's the main driver file that ANT uses when we actually start to run the DITA Open Toolkit. Also down here, there's two other files, startcommand.bat, startcommand.shell, and we're going to be using those once when we're ready to actually run the DITA Open Toolkit. But let's look at the folders. So the first folder to look at, it's actually somewhat anticlimactic because it doesn't do a lot, but it's useful to know. Some of you may not be aware that XML files, you can add to an XML file a directive pointing to a CSS file. And when you then open up that XML file using a browser, the browser will find the directive, find the CSS file, and will format your XML file just as CSS formats an HTML file. This is a useful thing. It can be nice. But it's not really that useful for DITA stuff because, of course, this means you have to add this directive to each of your DITA files. You also don't get any behavior such as cross-references, conrefs. None of that works. But it's interesting sometimes for previewing. And you'll notice here there are CSS files for all of our favorite common topic types. So we've got topic, task, concept, reference. So there are CSS files that support it, but these really don't do much. I've never had a chance to use them, but also a note, if you're producing HTML and using CSS with that HTML, these have nothing to do with the CSS that's generated with your HTML. Now, the next folder is much more interesting. The demo folder and the plugins folder go together. And this is a historical reason. When the DITA Open Toolkit was first released, the demo folder was used for all the plugins. Over time, the Open Toolkit evolved and the plugin folder was added. And when I build a plugin for the DITA Open Toolkit, I add in the plugins folder. Now in 1.5.3, Open Toolkit fully embraces the plugin folder, and we'll see that in just a minute. But as I said, historically contains plugins. There are some plugins that contain hard-coded links to demo, and so it is still used for some of those plugins. There's other things that remain in here now for historical reason. But moving on, the doc folder. This is a useful folder, all of the documentation on the DITA Open Toolkit. This is all in DITA format. It's also being handily converted to a variety of output formats for you, so that we've got Quick Start Guide is both in CHUM and in PDF. We have a README, and it's available in a CHUM as well as a PDF. Now, if you're using 143, you're actually at an advantage here, and this is something I'm kind of upset that they took away. In 143, the doc folder actually contained the entire DITA specification also, so it was a handy place to go if you needed to quickly see what attributes or what elements were available for a particular element. But no more since 1.5. Now, the other reason this is useful is because all these files exist as DITA files also, it serves as a good reference for how to do things. They also serve as a good test case. If you're working on a customization and want to see how well it converts your some DITA files, then you can use these files as a starting point. Particularly if you're dealing with content that is theoretical, that is, people want to develop your specializations or your customizations before you actually have any real content available. The DTD folder, this is, now we're getting down into some real nuts and bolts of how the Open Toolkit works. The DTD folder actually contains all the DTDs, that is the document type definitions for each of your DITA document types. So the DTD, of course, defines the content model for your documents. The DTD is used when validating your documents to make sure they are actually valid, they meet all the standards. Now in 143, there's a slight difference. You'll notice here I've got a 143. I'm going to look at the DTD folder there. You'll notice in 143 the DTD folder was flat. All of the DTD files and their accompanying files are all in the same folder. In 1.5, much more organization was added to this, and so now we have things subdivided. So we have a base folder. So this is where the base implementation of DTD things. So we've got common elements, and a number of the domains are defined here in this base area. And then for each of the various specialization areas, we have a different folder. If you're looking for where our friends concept, task, and reference are defined, they're here in technical content. So we'll see there's technical content. Within there, there's another DTD folder. And then in this DTD folder, we have files for each of our topic types. Now, you'll notice that for each type, there are 3 files. Let me just explain that a little bit. The ent files just define some entities, some domain entities that are used by the DTD and the mod files. The DTD itself, this is the main thing that's found when trying to resolve a DTD, but the DTD file itself, all it does is say these are the domains that these elements participate in, and then points off to the mod file. The mod file is actually where things happen. So if you're going to be going down and modifying, doing specializations, the mod file is probably where you're going to be working. The mod file actually defines the content model. So I've been referring to content model a few times already, but just to, by further explanation, the content model is the thing that says a task topic consists of a title, followed by a short description, followed by a task body. Or it says the steps element consists of one or more step elements. Or a step element consists of a command followed by this, that, and the other thing. So all of those relationships are defined in the mod file. The other thing the mod file does is it defines the attributes that are used for each element. And if an attribute has named values for it, if it's enumerated, so for instance, the type attribute on a note, you can say this is a note, this is a warning, this is a caution, this is info. The attribute definition in the mod file also declares those enumerations. I said the full easy install has everything that you need, and the lib file is where a lot of the stuff lives that, that drives that. So we can see here in the lib folder we have Saxon. So this is the Saxon XSL processor, and this is what does a lot of the transforms that produce your output. We also here we have a few Java jar files. One of the other ones to point out is the DOST jar file. This actually stands for the DITA Open Source Toolkit, so it's like DITA Open Toolkit jar file. By way of explanation, there are a number of things in the DITA Open Toolkit. Most things in the transforms are done by XSL, but there are a few things that XSL is not good at, and two of those are complex data storage and string manipulation. Sometimes in building the basic transforms for the Open Toolkit, the creators of the Open Toolkit realized there were some things that were much easier to do in Java, and so these are implemented as Java classes in the DOS.jar file. Now, if you're modifying the Open Toolkit or looking for where in an XSL to modify things, one of the things you don't want to find in your log file for where something gets transformed is the word pipeline. The pipeline in the log file says this is something being handled in the DOS.jar file. When you find that, you have two alternatives, really. You can either modify, you can find the sources for the DOS.jar file, modify them, recompile it, and add it back into your Open Toolkit, or you can figure out a way to work around or modify the output from DOS.jar. Now, as I said, demo and plugins work together. So demo is where plugins used to live, plugins where any forward-looking plugin live. And now in DITA 153, you'll notice that all of the standard output types actually have their own entry here in the plugin. So if you're familiar with DITA Open Toolkit 152, or if you've had any experience with this, you'll see that there's actually nothing really in the plugins file folder other than a file that I put there. Now in 153, they've much more formalized the organization of the plugins and actually named each of the components. And so here we have org.dita starts all of these that come from the DITA working group. And we can see here each of the various output types I referred to. So we have ODT for Word type outputs. We've got PDF. We've got Java help, HTML help, Eclipse help. We have DocBook output. You can see all these live here. And again, if I create a plugin, I'm going to put my plugin right here, and we're going to run it. Resource. The resource folder contains things that are used in building outputs, and the only two files that I really use or really have ever had anything to do with in this folder are the common LTR and common RTL.css files. This is standard left to right and right to left CSS information for HTML output. So if you were to use the standard HTML transform in DITA, then the common left to right and common right to left CSS files would be included in your output. Samples is a useful place for a couple of reasons. One is there's a number of sample DITA files here, and so if we follow this hierarchy.dita map, we will see it points to a series of tasks and concepts. If you've seen examples of the DITA Open Toolkit, you've seen the garage samples, and so there's changing the oil and spray painting and taking out the garbage and all that stuff. This is where that comes from. And again, like the doc folder, these are very useful things for testing early versions of your customizations of the DITA Open Toolkit. The other useful thing here in the samples folder is the ant sample folder. Now the ant sample folder contains a series of sample project files, and we'll ignore the template files, but each of these sample files contains the essentially the ANT fundamentals for a project file that will build output, will easily build output. And if you use these files, you don't have to remember all sorts of incantations and things on the command line when you run the DITA Open Toolkit. Instead of typing in, as we will in just a few minutes, typing in the entire length of the DITA Open Toolkit command line, you can just run one of these files, and that's much easier. And we'll also take a look at that in just a minute. The schema folder is structured just like the DTD folder. And that is because schema is just another way of describing the content model of the DITA specializations. Schema is related to DTDs. DTD uses a language, sort of a meta language for defining your content model, but it's not XML. It's a language unto itself. Schema actually uses XML for describing XML. And it's actually much more powerful than DTD. It's much stronger on type checking and things like that. But unfortunately, it's not used a lot. When I do Open Toolkit modifications, I almost always focus in the DTD folder. I've never had to do anything where I needed to modify the schema folder. But as you can see, it's organized just the same as the DTDs. Tools just contains the ANT folder. So as I said, ANT is the driving force behind the DITA Open Toolkit. It's the thing that makes things work. ANT is, or more formally, Apache ANT is a build technology, very much like Make, and it was originally developed for creating Java executables. But it's very, very flexible and has been extended for doing publishing. In a couple other jobs I've done, I've used ANT for implementing publication architectures. It's a useful thing. And I'd say if you're going to have anything to do with the least little bit of modifying DITA Open Toolkit or being aware of what's going on inside your Open Toolkit, learning ANT is a very, very good thing to do. Finally, we have the XSL folder. And of course, XSL is where everything really happens in the DITA Open Toolkit. This is where the transforms live. This is where the XSLT code lives that then takes your DITA source files and transforms them into HTML, into FO, into DocBook, into RTF, into whatever format you're generating an output. Just a slight further explanation of the plugins folder and the contents of the plugins folder. Whenever I build a plugin, it is sort of a microcosm of the overall DITA folder. So if my plugin needs to do modifications to the DTDs, then my plugin will also have a DTD folder which will contain my own DTD modifications. If I've got resources that I need to add to my output, images, additional CSS files, things like that, I'll have my own resource file. If I need to have, of course, XSL transforms, additional XSL transforms on top of overriding what's done here, then my plugin folder will contain an XSL folder. And while I'm talking about that, I might as well just show it. Here's a plugin. And you can see here we've actually got a doc folder of our own. So here we explain, here's the doc, here's lib. That's for another reason. We have a resource folder. We actually have some samples and an XSL folder. So that's how I organize the plugins. Now, there are two other folders that will exist eventually in your Open Toolkit folder after you run the Open Toolkit once. And the first is the output folder, or out folder. And this, of course, contains your output, or it's the nominal place where your output's put. And the other is a temp folder. The temp folder, when the DITA Open Toolkit works, is a number of intermediate files. Now, most of the time, the contents of the temp folder are deleted after your when the Open Toolkit finishes running. But you can also pass a special property to the Open Toolkit to say don't delete the temp folder, and we will see that in just a few minutes. So let's get on to running the DITA Open Toolkit. So I'm just sort of glancing here at what's with this one. Oh, we'll get to that later, Eve. I was just looking over some of the questions here we're amassing. So, running the DITA Open Toolkit. Well, the first thing we need to do to run the DITA Open Toolkit is we go to our Open Toolkit folder. So here we are. And as I pointed out at the beginning of the tour, the Open Toolkit has a start_command.bat, start_command.shell file. These are command files that define environment variables. The environment variables tell the DITA Open Toolkit where ant is, where Saxon is, where XSLFO is, where all the files are that it's going to be using. If you're using Windows, then you want start_command.bat. If you're using Macintosh or Unix, then you want to run start_command.shell. And if you're using Macintosh, there's a slight modification you need to make to your environment variables. And if you go to our website and search Macintosh DITA, you will find a small blog post on the modifications that you need to make to do that. But we're going to run start_command.bat. So it created all my environment variables and then opened a window for me, a DOS window. And from here, we want to run the DITA Open Toolkit with using ant. So we'll say ant-f build.xml. And now we want to specify what our input file is. So we say args.input, and what we're going to do is we're going to run the garage samples. So we're going to come here to samples. I'm going to get to show you one of my favorite DOS tricks, stupid DOS tricks. Rather than type in the full path and everything for this file name, I can just click on this file and drag it into the DOS window, and lo and behold, the whole path gets pasted in. So that's there. So we're going to run on hierarchy.ditamap, and now we need to specify what transformation type we're going to do. So I'm going to say D, trans type. So D is what you use for passing properties to ant. Nine seconds later, we're done. So now we can look at our output folder. And sure enough, here in output, we've got hierarchy.pdf, and it's 139, which is what my clock says. So we can double click on this. And I just need to blow that into the window. So we can see here we've got, the PDF created our bookmarks. Created all of our topics, turned our topics into nice so that's running the DITA Open Toolkit. So just as a review, so we said ant-f build.xml, and then we named both args.input, which allowed us to specify the input. Now we can specify just a DITA file here if we wanted. I wanted to specify a map, and then we specified the transformation type. Now, as I've been saying, there are easier ways, and what I've done here, I've taken one of the sample files from the ant samples folder, and I've called it runotpdf.xml. So an ant file, and it's a very simple one. All it says is look for build.xml, and then just as we did, we specify args.input. We specify a trans type. A couple of other things that I'm going to do, I'm going to specify an output directory, and I'm also going to say don't delete the temporary folder, which, by the way, we should see. Let's look here. So yes, now we have an output folder, and we have a temp folder right now that's empty. So I want to run that, run my DITA Open Toolkit, and I want to just use this project file instead. So we say ant-f runot say ant-f and name this file. And so, of course, if you're developing, if you're customizing or specializing the DITA Open Toolkit, you don't want to have to type in the full ant command all the time. So these files make it a whole lot easier for running and testing the Open Toolkit. Just a bit on how the Open Toolkit works. So we say ant-f build.xml, and build is like I say, an ant project file, and through the magic of the plugin architecture, it contains import commands for a whole number of other ant project files for all the various output targets. And so there's a target called DITA to PDF. There's a target called DITA to ODT, another one called DITA to HTML help. So all these targets exist in the build.xml file. So when we name a transformation type in that trans type property, the build file finds the target DITA to whatever trans type and then starts to perform a number of actions. Now, each of these targets vary depending, of course, upon that transformation type, but they all do fundamentally the same thing. They all do some pre-processing first on the file. So I mentioned the temp folder, and the temp folder contains preprocessor intermediate files. Before the DITA Open Toolkit gets to doing the mainline processing of your DITA files, it does a number of things, such as resolving your cross-references. It resolves your conrefs. It resolves your key refs. It populates your, if you have a DITA map with nested DITA maps, it actually resolves all that nesting in the pre-processing phase. Then if you're generating PDFs, the trans type actually merges all of your DITA files, all the individual DITA topics, into one big DITA topic. Then your DITA files, those pre-processed and possibly merged files, are then actually transformed to the output format. And then the target may perform a number of other options, other actions, such as moving or copying. It may move some files, may delete some files. It may add some resource files, image files that you might be using. CSS files will get moved. All sorts of things like that happen in the post-processing phase. And, of course, if you're doing something like PDF or HTML help, then the Open Toolkit runs the compiler to generate your final output. So at this stage, this is where the FO processor, where FOP or Antenna House or RenderX XEP, or if you're going to chum file, the Microsoft HTML help compiler gets run at this stage. So moving on a bit and looking more at plugins. So the plugin architecture is a very useful thing in the DITA Open Toolkit, and it's based on two basic ideas. The first is that for each plugin file that you have, there is a plugin.xml file. And this plugin.xml file describes all the places in the Open Toolkit that your plugin needs to modify. Each of these is identified by a feature element, and these are called extension points. So each extension point, as I said, it's a change to the Open Toolkit. So you might have an extension point that says, I need to modify the ANT processing, or I need to modify the DTD to add my own specialization, or I need to modify the XSL processing that occurs through my plugin. And all the extension points, oh, and you can also modify the pre-processing. You can modify a lot of things through these extension points. If you go to ditaxml.org, all of the extension points that are available are listed there. You could also just Google DITA extension points. I should put quotes around that. Just Google the word DITA extension points, and that'll get you pretty quickly to this page on ditaxml.org where the extension points are listed. So the other part of the plugin architecture, in addition to the plugin.xml files, is the integrator. And what the integrator does is it takes all of your plugin XML files for all the plugins in your Open Toolkit, and then integrates their change to the various files they need to change. So let's take a look a little bit more in depth. So as I mentioned, your plugin might say that it's got changes for catalog.xml. This is how you point to changes for the DTD. So here's a catalog.xml, and we've got some of my own files, my demo.dtd.mod.end. It may have some additional XSL processing. So here's where we point to a custom XSL where we've got style sheet, we've got template overrides for our XSL. We also might want to point out different changes to the ANT processing. We may need to say, oh, you've got to run this in such compiler in order to build this. So this is just one plugin. This is my plugin, and it has to play well with everybody else's plugin. So here we have 3 plugins organized just as that plugin was that I showed you. We've got plugin 1, plugin 2, and plugin 3. And each of these points to various files that it modifies once modifying. When we run the integrator goes to each of the plugin files, or it actually goes through the demo folder and the plugins folder and finds any folder that contains a plugin.xml file. So we can see here, here is my plugin, and you notice it has a file plugin.xml. So it finds that, it finds all of them. Then what the integrator does is it takes all similar extension points and integrates them together and then makes modifications to template files based on that change. So every change for catalogs, the integrator finds the catalog DITA _template file in the DITA Open Toolkit and adds all the changes from all the plugins for the catalog and generates a new file called catalog.dita.xml. It does the same thing for all the XSL modifications. It gathers together all XSL modifications, then finds DITA to, and if these are HTML modifications, it finds DITA to XHTML template and integrates them into that file and creates DITA to XHTML.xsl. The same thing for any of the ANT stuff is done. Build template is then transformed into build.xml. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is we've got this pattern of a template file building a new file. And this is sort of a caveat if you're messing around in the DITA Open Toolkit. Wrong folder, wrong window. If we go up top here in the DITA Open Toolkit, we'll see here's our build.xml, and here down a little bit further because of alphabetization, we've got build template.xml. When you look through here and all of the DITA Open Toolkit, you'll notice files. Here's catalog DITA XML and catalog DITA template XML right next to each other. You'll notice these 2 files together. Now, normally you should modify these files through the plugin architecture, but sometimes you might, if you're just messing around with things or just trying to experiment, you might be tempted to go and modify the catalog DITA file, say. That's a bad choice because this file gets created new every time the integrator is run. And the integrator can be run by almost anybody at any time. And if you notice, even in my sample, in my ANT sample, one of the things I did in this file was I ran the integrator without you even knowing it before I ran our transform. So this just ensures that if I'm modifying a transform, if I've got something new that's going to have to get the integrator run, then I don't have to worry about remembering to run it. It's just run automatically. Anyway, so look on these files as ephemeral. The catalog DITA, you cannot modify this because the next time the integrator gets run, it's going to get overwritten. If you need to make a change, come here. That is, if you really do need to make a change, come here to catalog DITA template and make a change to the template file. And that way, every time the integrator is run, your change in the template will then be propagated into the output catalog DITA file. So that's it for the plugin. That's it for the theory of the integrator. So let's actually look at what's involved in adding a plugin. It's It's really hard, you'll see. I'm joking. So let's go to our plugins folder. Here's our plugins folder. We've got org.dita plugins. And then let's also go here. We've got another folder here where my OT intro, where I've got a plugin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this plugin and just drop it right here into this folder. So the plugin's almost there. Now what we want to do is integrate this. So we come into our DITA Open Toolkit, our command window, and we say ant-f integrator.xml. Hit enter, it runs the integrator, and now my plugin is plugged into the Open Toolkit. And that's really all it took. Now, what does this plugin do? Well, this is the plugin that we've developed here that generates web help. And so we can see this run, easy enough, just say ant-f build.xml args.input. Now, of course, I could have gone up and just edited the line, but I thought that might be a little bit too confusing. So again, we're just going to run it on the hierarchy. And this time we're going to say -d trans type equals SPS So one last caveat about working with the plugins. Let me find the right folder here to show you. One of my habits when dealing with folders of stuff in Windows is if I want to save a copy off to the side, I might take an entire folder and make a copy of it. So if I was going to do something to my plugin here, I could just make a copy here, and then I could go and work on this one with impunity, and know that if I needed to fail back to anything, to fall back, I could always find the old copy here. Now, with the way the plugin architecture works, that's a problem, because we notice that each of these folders, there's a plugin.xml file here and a plugin.xml file here. And so even though I've made a copy, a safe copy, when I run the integrator, both of these plugin.xml files are going to be recognized by the integrator. So I need to take one additional step if I'm going to do that. I have to say something like not used plugin.xml. And just by making that change to the name now, this plugin.xml file will not be used by the integrator. So this is the voice of experience. I once had an experience. I was debugging something and could not figure out why something wasn't changing no matter what I did. And finally I thought, oh, I know. There's a plugin.xml file there. So that's disabling the plugins. And that's just about it. So overall, DITA Open Toolkit, relatively easy to download and install. It's easy to run, as long as you don't have a fear of the DOS command line. It's easy enough to add plugins. It contains all the components that you need for running the DITA Open Toolkit, apart from Java, and almost all modern machines have Java on anyway. We can use the DITA Open Toolkit for creating most commonly used output formats, and localization for the Open Toolkit is built right in. So just a word here on the localization I probably should have mentioned. What do I mean when I say localization is built right in? Typically, if you're transforming something like a note, where you might have a note or a caution or a warning, the text note, caution, or warning isn't hard-coded into your files. That would be silly. Instead, it actually comes from the processor. So that's fine if you're in English, but what happens if you're, say, trying to produce Spanish output. You don't want the English word note to be there. You want the Spanish nota to be there. So the DITA Open Toolkit provides a number of files, 50 files in fact, that contain all of these common terms that are used when generating your output. I thank you all very much for your attention, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye-bye.